Welcome to the Cannaman podcast, hosted by Global Cannabinoid Solutions, the world's leading cannabis science firm and cannabis market entry specialists. We look forward to hearing your thoughts on this latest episode of Cannaman.
Hello, welcome to the another interview with Chris Tasker, the CEO of Global Cannabinoid Solutions, and we've got Andre Gomes today, a wizard of drug policy and drug reform. And Andre, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself slightly, and we'll get straight into a conversation.
Yes, a wizard is a great description. Well, hi, my name is Andre Gomes. As well as has been said, I am currently the social media and content coordinator at. So let's take it from the top, I guess, from the start here. So yeah, I mean, I started getting involved in this world. It started around 2015 was when I first managed to volunteer and intern at Release. So then I was just doing a lot of policy writing and article writing for Talking Drugs, which is their kind of international news platform that covers a lot of global views on drug policy developments that are happening. So at that point, I started to get very interested within this world, understanding that it has a lot of connections with social policy, with a lot of development work when we're talking at a more global scale. And obviously a huge amount of work in harm reduction that needs to happen. You know, this doesn't necessarily apply just to cannabis, but it's an important aspect to understand why drug policy is something that needs to happen. So yeah, when I was done with that, I finished my undergrad and started my master's working in doing research within the communication strategies that drug policy reform organizations can use to impact public opinion. So that was a wide-ranging research of all of the leading drug policy reform organizations within the UK, asking them basically, what are your messages? What are the main pieces of knowledge that you need to put out there to influence public opinion, to make sure that our points are getting across, and what is it that you exactly want to change? So because of confidentiality of what I discussed there, I can't specify exactly what every organization said, but across the board, there was an understanding that the current model of lack of regulation of drugs isn't working. We need to find something that is going to be appropriate for industry, but also appropriate for the people that have historically been harmed by the repressive and punitive drug policies that we have. And also finding models that then can equitably redistribute the revenue and the gains that these markets are then going to have. And this is something that is very important for cannabis because, I mean, I'm sure that you know, cannabis is going to be most likely one of the first drugs that is going to be regulated and controlled in this now like post-prohibition period where it's no longer the question of when is it going to happen, it's how it's going to happen. How are these actual markets going to be regulated and controlled? And how can we start putting those models in from the beginning?
So, to take a few steps backwards, Andre, where is UK drug policy at the moment, and maybe as well, what is the perception of the government and legislators around drugs, and where has it been? And yeah, could you talk a bit more about sort of the progression that's being made, and I guess the paradigm shift and the perception change that's coming about as more of this research is coming out, and again, other countries around the world are taking a liberal view. Could you paint a bit of a current events picture, I suppose, of what the UK like and where we stand in the grand scheme of things compared to other countries around Europe and around the world?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the UK has always been a tricky one once it comes to its relationship with cannabis because it did have at the beginning of the 2000s quite an increase on the use of cannabis, and policy reaction to it was, with most drugs, when they start to be increasing of use, of preoccupation about what it means for our children and what it means for society, and that it needed to have more control. And It's been heavily researched as well, the amount of the rescheduling and the descheduling that happened around cannabis. So in the first decade of the 2000s, there was a belief that it was a drug that didn't need to have such hard controls, so it had been descheduled, which then led to a rise in its use and then eventual preoccupation about this, and then to a rescheduling up from a substance C to a substance B class. So it is a difficult relationship where the actual arguments of public health and the protection that come around it were very much imbued with this idea that there more of it is creating harm to society. And it kind of makes sense from a policy perspective. It did make sense because by changing its scheduling, you're not actually incurring any of the benefits that cannabis can bring to society. You're still keeping it as an illegal substance. There is still no revenue that is being brought in from its control, and you're still not funding the medical and the social services that require for you to be able to take care of people that have problematic relationships with drugs. So that was kind of the beginning of the most recent decade as well. Now entering this new world, you started to have real policy changes in the US that then all the news started to come out from it. The world didn't fall apart. Things were actually working, and there was actually money coming in. Now, there's different models, obviously, in the US of the best states that do create different models of how you're then supporting society around it, you know, and there's definitely bits to take out from it. There's definitely bits that would work better in the UK context as well than others. But since a lot of this information starts to get downloaded into the country, you start to have an idea that, wait a minute, maybe a regulated market would actually work. You had work from drug science and from a lot of these other organizations looking at the potential market, the potential number of medical cannabis patients within the UK and what this market would look like. The economic argument started to be something that was very seriously pushed and starting to make sense for a lot of people. And usually with more conservative and social governments, it's something that can work as a strong argument. So you did have organizations like Voltfast, you know, issuing studies with the Adam Smith Institute, looking at the size of this potential market here, how many people would benefit, what are the different aspects of the treasury that would benefit from it. So this argument did start to take place. You do have some politicians across the spectrum that do support the social equity, the redistribution of wealth arguments. I mean, I would say that probably the biggest champion in the UK right now, at least the most vocal of champions, has been David Lammy as well. That he speaks a lot about the redistribution of health and the equity that needs to come with these markets, which is an argument that hasn't necessarily been brought up by policy, by cannabis policy groups that are probably more interested in and funded by the companies coming from North America that have been making all their money within this industry, that are now looking to open to a market that is going to speak the same language, that already doesn't need more branding, it just needs more access.
You mentioned earlier on harm reduction, and I should probably have given a bit of context about this at the start, and maybe we do a little bit of an intro at the end, just to you, Andre, and the relevance of all of this, because obviously cannabis is only growing in popularity and in scale, but with that, we've got a lot of harms that could potentially arise from the uninformed consumption of it, as well as with other drugs too. And I was wondering if you might be able to explain for people what harm reduction is and what the sort of mentality and the logic behind it is as well. Because it's definitely not discussed enough in cannabis conversations, and particularly the medical world. We're not really looking at the potential negative impacts of uninformed interactions with cannabis and other drugs. And so, yeah, could you break some of that down for us, please, Andre?
Yeah, of course. Of course. I mean, harm reduction it's a really interesting concept then to start to look at how it interacts with the cannabis world. So at its basis, harm reduction operates from the belief that people are going to be using drugs. We have been trying to criminalize them and control them as much as we can, and existing in a drug-free world is something that doesn't seem practical or possible. So harm reduction then explores how we can reduce the amount of harms, essentially both to the individual and to society, from the consumption, sale, possession of these drugs. Within cannabis, this specifically applies to, or rather, there are certain policy models that can then better integrate harm reduction. Harm reduction itself, for example, lends itself to models of decriminalization. If we are able to possess a certain amount of cannabis, then you are able to take care of these offenses that were previously of possession with a much more measured approach. So, for example, in Portugal, what's done if you're caught with under 5 grams of hashish or under 25 grams of cannabis flower, you are sent to a committee of dissuasion. That this group is built not of a police officer or any law enforcement agents, but of a social worker, a psychologist, and someone from the Ministry of Health. That they then engage in a conversation with you that, depending on the quantity and the way that you are using, would at most issue you a fine that you can then pay at the times that best work for you, but also find out, it's a point of interaction with a person to figure out whether they have problematic use, that they think that they have an unhealthy relationship with cannabis, and if this is something that they're looking to change. So look how this possibility would be fantastic, but then it lacks that push for it. We've reached the stage where the UK has never had more drug-related deaths in its history. Since records have begun, a radical answer is needed, but there's still from people outside of the government.
I guess that takes us nicely, Andre, into why we need some of these strategies and why we need to rethink the current policy. I was wondering if you might be able to outline for people like what problems are happening and what problems are developing because of our current drug policy, and how is perhaps the Misuse of Drugs Act contributing to doing more harm than necessarily good at the moment. And yeah, because we maybe haven't covered that quite enough for people. It's a really important aspect of why we're even having this conversation. There are problems and they're just not being discussed at the moment. So yeah, could you give us a little overview of, or paint a bit of a picture for us as to the impact of the Misuse of Drugs Act at the moment, and yeah, what impact that's having on people's lives at the moment in the UK?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's difficult to quantify this, especially like for my own stuff. Release has been working on this for 50 years, and they're probably the center of expertise that once it comes to understanding how exactly these laws have been impacting society. There's huge amount of work that is being done on the disproportionate policing of minority ethnicity communities, because it's I was just reading this stat on a cannabis report that even though white people tend to be the largest drug using population within the UK, people of minority ethnicities are incredibly more policed, to the point of black populations being up to 8 times more likely to be stopped and searched by already, not just in terms of the psychological impact that it has, but also then the economic impact that it has on populations that are already operating at a disadvantaged role, that then have to deal with having to disclose any sort of drug offenses that they have, if they've been arrested for anything. Most of the times that people are interacting with the police, especially if you're from a minority population, is going to be with a distrusting attitude, and that is something that is very difficult to break, and it really ties into so many other social issues as well, into violence in communities and all this work. Specifically due to the Misuse of Drugs Act, the best example is Scotland. Scotland has an incredibly high number of drug-related deaths. They are unable to alter the way that they control drugs or what I mean by this is how the Misuse of Drugs Act is actually implemented in their nation, because it is centrally decided by the UK government. So if Holyrood wants to change the criminalization of a particular drug so that they can then offer more health more social policies that are attached to it, to divert some funding from policing drug use to the actual services to support people with it, they can't, because this is something that is centrally controlled by the UK government. This then needs to be taken up to Parliament, which is then just going to be rejected. Even if the SNP all voted in favor of changing the drug laws, this would not happen, because they're just a drop in the ocean compared to the rest of the country's opinion. So there's big problems once it comes to that. Reforming, or better yet, reform needs to happen within the act, but there are some things that can still be done within the law. So a lot of harm reduction options can still be explored. Needle and syringe programs, opioid substitution therapy, a lot of these different policies can happen within the act itself, but the act is enforcing decriminalization of these substances. You can decriminalize cannabis up to a certain amount and all this kind of stuff, but you are not able to legally enforce a market. So having a regulated market is something that is quite explicitly prohibited within the Misuse of Drugs Act and across the UN. What the US states are doing is an infringement of this UN protocol. And this is why they're having so much issue with moving money across the federal country, because it's still illegal at that level. So it's a very complicated way around it, because if you do want to have that legal market, you do need to change this act. This act is something that is already internationally supported, but could obviously be challenged by some of its member states, which is what we hope the UK will do. And the Misuse of Drugs Act, quite critically, doesn't actually deal with the expungement of potential crimes that people have been involved with the drug market. And this is something that is really...
So taking a few steps back again, I don't want, as much as I love keeping this on the cannabis front, I think it would be a shame if we didn't talk about some of the other elements as well, because the only reason that I'm aware of this is because I ended up doing some community work, and cannabis sort of opened up my eyes to wider drug reform, and I didn't realize quite the scale of the issue. And if we're having these issues with cannabis, it applies to just about every drug. And I've had people almost describe it as a form of terrorism in a way, which obviously quite an extreme perception of viewing it, but it's on that scale where people are traumatized, there are scars, and then there are lasting social impacts from some of these interactions with the police, and that criminalization sort of experience is really quite horrible and persecuting, and particularly if you're unwell, and particularly if you are chronically ill, suffering with mental health conditions, that's only going to exacerbate things. And so on that note, what do you think is really blocking progress at the moment, Andrea? Like, how could we maybe nudge the needle further forward? Obviously, you mentioned that the Misuse of Drugs Act ties things up quite significantly, and then also at a UN level, international law, that it goes all the way to the top. And so what are some of the ways that you think that we can bring about some of this change and have a bit more of a impact as sort of a community, as activists, as entrepreneurs as well? How can the industry as well even get involved and really progress the situation, and maybe raise the profile of the conversation more?
Yeah, I mean, that's the $1 million question,
Pretty broad question.
How we can actually solve this, Yeah, but it's... Are you talking about specifically what the cannabis movement, the cannabis world and industry can do for the wider drug policy?
Well, I guess I see it as that after I wouldn't say it's very easy to categorize and box things off and sort of separate them out and go, oh, well, we're just talking about cannabis here, or we're just talking about heroin here, or other drugs. But I think really it's all part of a larger drug conversation. And I think the danger is that we separate off, fraction up the conversation without looking at the big picture and say, well, look, it's not just cannabis where we have this issue, but it's also, say, psychedelics as well, and other drugs that have always sort of been on that criminal fringe, but have also had, that interaction isn't just limited to cannabis and other drugs. It's universal, and there's again a broad range of a very broad conversation to have that could maybe help unfold some of this. And I just worry, and say I worry, it's not really a worry, but it seems as though we're getting these conversations too fragmentedly, and it maybe needs a broader perception that cannabis is a drug, alcohol is a drug, psychedelics are drugs. It's not just cannabis, the plant, and other things like that. It's drugs as a whole. We really need to sort of rethink and reperceive how we interact with them, how we legislate for them. And so with that, are there maybe, and again, coming from a more of a policy focused perspective, are there ways to influence that policy, or what specific holes in that could maybe be improved upon? Obviously, as a whole, it's the Misuse of Drugs Act blocks the market conversation, but are there ideas or new approaches that are maybe being implemented that are looking at ways that we can overcome some of these conversations and maybe build a bit more of a unified drug reform conversation? Because I think it helps all the facets of all the industries if by having that joint conversation, and it's all part of the same picture, I think. But
I mean, I think you just hit it there on the head as well, because the first step that needs to be happening across the drug policy movement, and this applies to any drug, is understanding that the logic for not criminalizing cannabis is the same logic that applies to every single drug on the market. Prohibition is simply not working for any drug, from cannabis to heroin to any sort of substance that you look at. So I agree completely that there can't be an exceptionalism that happens with any drug. Cannabis is not going to be different from psychedelics, which is also not different from any opioids as well, MDMA, from any of these substances. So they do need to be controlled in a better way. These conversations need to happen together. They shouldn't be siloed, like you're saying. And I think that is something that needs to happen when cannabis groups are having conversations. Is so important to have people that are policy experts, and they're not just cannabis policy experts as well, because they will not be considering the entire market. Like you're saying, alcohol is still a drug as well. All these perceptions, they need to be ingrained in wider society as well, and they need to go across it as well. And sometimes this works with particular campaigns. There's some campaigns that have been very good, and if people do think that they want to support this movement, the best way to do is to keep donating to these movements as well. We have purchasing power. We need to support people with us. It's still a capitalist society at the end of the day. Where we put our money is where change is going to happen. A perfect example, and a big shout out to Anyone's Child as well. As you know, this campaign here in the UK, they advocate for every single, for its family members and friends of people that have lost someone to a drug overdose or overconsumption of a particular drug, and in the bottom of their heart they have understood beyond their personal grief and their loss that this would not have happened if this person would have been able to look out for the right supports, find the right supports from social services, from psychological services, and also not have to fear criminal repression if they are going to go and speak with law enforcement, with any position of authority. So supporting these campaigns is great. Finding one that is aligned with your own interests, and anyone's child is pretty much the one that has had the most support. They have gone to parliament multiple times. They have engaged in huge conversations with politicians and actually have had success in raising their causes. Bringing your MP to these movements, to these meetings as well, is something that needs to happen. I think that in our society, we've started to take our approach with politics like the World Cup. You know, you think that it only happens every 4 years when you go to vote, and engaging in civic duty and your responsibility is an important way of demonstrating your interests to your political representatives. Otherwise, they're not very representative. Um, and engaging with a wider conversation that needs to happen as well. So not just within the drug policy, but understanding the social environment within which people are using drugs, and extending a bit of love and compassion and understanding for why people are using these drugs in certain situations. So,
and I think it's probably been too long that some of this has just been left to slide. And I'd see it as our civic duty, as well as cannabis people, cannabis businesses as well. It's not, obviously there is that stigma, and if you're a cannabis business, you don't want to be seen to be supporting heroin use and things like that. But ultimately, it's about like, what might be some of the reasons that predispose people even to some of this problematic use.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on this authority as well, so this is obviously from a conversational element. I think people like Dr. Carl Hart, Dr. Gabor Mate, they wrote way more about this as well. And also a recent book by Maya on undoing drugs as well, and understanding the science behind addiction. I think people in a lot of contexts can be using drugs for pain alleviation, but this isn't really like the throes kind of deep use and of really problematic use, and I think that's kind of what you're getting at. In terms of adverse childhood events, I think that a lot of people can have trauma, and this in essence is a lot of what it is. It's unprocessed trauma that drugs can help either alleviate or numb these sensations and these challenges that are coming within your head, you know. And we still haven't reached a point in society where it's comfortable to be talking about drug use, and also of dealing with trauma that we have. I mean, I don't know about you, but personally and within my childhood, it was still very difficult to, it's still quite stigmatized to go to a therapist only if you are really bad or there's something wrong with you. So seeking psychological help is something that isn't necessarily very commonplace in society, and drugs then come in and fill that void. So I think that it's very easy for people to then find a comfort, not just chemically for what it does to you, but in the community and the involvement that that brings you around. So if people are already in a difficult economic situation and they find that they can build a community of people that they can all use drugs together, and that they are all coming from similar backgrounds, they have all had similar traumas, they had all similar challenges, that all of these aspects are being brought together, that really can encourage more and more drug use as well. Once it comes to opiates as well, the habituation, the repeated use creates a sort of feedback loop in your head that you can only receive pleasure or find numbing from your situation by the use of this drug. If you're already in a condition when you don't have much going for you, if you don't have regular employment, this is something that is very easy to do, to occupy both your time and to distract yourself of difficult emotions that you're having. This is an incredibly like lay explanation of the science, you know, and obviously like I do want people to take this with a bit of like a pinch of salt, but the conditions that we're in really push for people to go deeper into their drug use, helping people out of these conditions, whilst also like you obviously need effort from people themselves as well to have an interest to be pulling themselves out of these situations is also important. But a lot of times this environment which they're with using drugs within, and these unprocessed trauma and challenges that are within people's minds, can lead to problematic use.
For you, Andre, what was maybe the most impactful lesson or piece of information that you've learned that really just changed your mind on drug policy?
Oh, that,
I mean, it's a
yeah,
lot.
on policy, or at kind of like a personal level within this?
Well, I think a personal level, because it's quite a paradigm shift to go through, and yeah, it's quite an intimate thing, I guess, to have that sort of unraveling of, oh, actually, there's quite a big story here and quite a big picture to this. Can you sort of break down what it was maybe that sort of inspired you to get into drug policy further, and what sort of things were you reading that really triggered that intention to go into this deeper and further?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a big part of it came from my own personal experiences with drugs, and also the kind of ingrained shame that came around it, and understanding that, like, why do I feel bad for? Why should I feel bad for something that is bringing me pleasure as well? Why should I, like, this is going to impact my employment opportunities? People are going to see badly about this. What are my parents going to think about me if they find out? Like, all this kind of shame and stigma, essentially, that has just been built into me from years and years of media, of seeing, like, pictures of people that are completely lost in their throes of drugs. It's an ingrained kind of moment that comes with you. So it's been a journey as well to figure out, to get out of this mentality, and to figure out, like, what exactly is a healthy relationship with drugs that I can have. And personally, I'm looking always for a more sustainable way of using the drugs in general. And I think by sustainable, I mean that something that I can stay fantastic. Yes, be kind to the other, suspend your judgment of other people, and you can help understand them a bit better. There's a lot of policy work that can support everything, but you just have to be kind to people that are going through hardships.
No, it's definitely an improving trend, but it's obviously not easy for everyone to understand, and it's a lot of reading as well to go through and understand why are people using these drugs, what might be motivating them, is it in our best interest as a society to criminalize everyone, throw them under the bus, slap them with prison sentences where they'll go and take more drugs, and then once they're out of prison as well, go and take more drugs, without that intervention and without that understanding, like you say. Andre, I want to say thank you for sort of opening the curtains, I guess, for a lot of people who maybe haven't had this perspective shared with them before now. And it's, I think, a shame, but something that I hope that we can keep sort of banging the drum for in the cannabis space as well, because everyone's so behind cannabis now, everyone's so behind CBD products and what have you. I'd really like to see them getting behind, well, look, if you're pissed off and if you're upset about cannabis, well, there's a lot of other drugs out there as well, and there's a lot of other harms and sort of harms that are being perpetuated, and a lot of injustices as well. And going back to equity and social impact, there's so much that reperceiving drugs as a whole can do for society, that it's such a shame that we're so focused on CBD and selling products that all of this is being overlooked at the moment. So I really appreciate you sort of breaking this down for everyone and just making it a bit more tangible and a bit more understanding. And thank you so much, Andre, and really appreciate your time. And to wrap up, do you have any concluding thoughts of people or a message for people? And again, maybe you want to plug some of the work you're doing with Release and some of the other drug reform groups as well, because again, doesn't get much coverage, and hopefully I'll put all the links obviously and things like that in the description.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we can also there's a bunch of things that we have mentioned as well throughout this, which I think would be good to reference as well. And I mean, if people are interested in understanding how law needs to change and what legal action can be taken, you just have to look at Release's work, release.org.uk. This is an organization that's been pushing for 50 years for real change and defending people that have drug-related issues. So it's very simple to go straight through there. I'm currently writing and working with Talking Drugs, which is exactly trying to cover aspects and angles of stories that haven't been covered by people that use drugs, by different countries that are experiencing different drug issues and how they can then be.
We hope you have enjoyed this episode of the Cannaman podcast. For more information on how you can safely navigate the cannabis ecosystem, take a look at some of our educational materials or reach out to us at www.globalcannabinoidsolutions.com. We look forward to you joining us on the next episode of the Cannaman podcast.